The October sky over Columbus hung low and gray, the kind of sky that presses down on a man's shoulders like a hand that refuses to let go. James Whitfield stood at the edge of a gravel path inside Lakeview Memorial Cemetery, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his breath forming small clouds that dissolved before they reached the marble headstone in front of him. He had been coming here every week for 11 months. He knew the exact number of steps from the iron gate to this spot. He knew which sections of gravel shifted under his feet. He knew the particular silence of this corner of the cemetery, walled on one side by a row of old oak trees that had already dropped most of their leaves, leaving only bare branches scratching at the sky. The headstone read Noah James Whitfield, beloved son. The dates beneath the name covered only 6 short years. James crouched down slowly and placed a small red plastic boat at the base of the stone. It was the kind of toy sold in a bin at a drugstore. Nothing special. The paint chipping on one side, the hull scuffed from years of being carried everywhere a small boy went. Noah had taken it to the bathtub to the back seat of the car, tucked under his arm at the grocery store. James had found it in the pocket of a jacket he hadn't worn since Frankfurt, 2 weeks after the funeral. He had sat on the floor of his closet holding it for 40 minutes before he could stand up again. He had carried it to this grave every week since. He straightened up, hands back in his pockets, and looked at the stone the way a man looks at something he has accepted but will never understand. "I closed the Hendricks deal Tuesday," James said quietly. His voice was flat, not performing grief, just talking the way a person talks when they've run out of other options. "You wouldn't care about that. You never cared about the office stuff. You used to ask me what the buildings looked like, not what they were worth." He paused. A crow landed on a nearby stone, looked at him sideways, then flew off. "Your room is the same. Mrs. Alvarez dusted it last Thursday. She dusts it every Thursday now. I don't ask her to. She just does." He had said different versions of these things for 11 months. He was not a man who talked much, not in the way people expected from someone who ran a company worth $300 million, not in meetings or on calls or at the dinners where everyone watched him. But here alone in front of this stone, the words came out without effort, without structure. Just a father talking to a piece of marble because the alternative was silence, and silence had proven itself to be a room with no door. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph he always brought. A summer afternoon, maybe 18 months before the stone existed. James was standing in the backyard of the house on Meridian Drive, Noah sitting on his shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. Noah's fistful of James's hair, both of them laughing at something the camera had caught right at the peak of the moment. James had printed it at a drugstore the week after the funeral, a 4x6 tucked inside the same wallet he carried to board meetings. He looked at it now the way he always did, searching the faces in it like there was something new to find. There was not. He was about to tuck it back when the voice came from behind him. "Mister." James turned. A girl stood maybe 10 feet away on the gravel path, 8 years old at most, wearing a school backpack over a green coat that was slightly too big for her. She had serious eyes, the kind that didn't look at things, they examined them. She was looking at him the same way the crow had, except she didn't fly away. James frowned. "Can I help you?" The girl took one step closer. She glanced at the headstone, then back at his face. Her voice was steady, not shy, not uncertain the way children speak when they have decided something in advance and are now simply reporting it. "The boy whose name is on that stone, he's alive. He eats breakfast at our table every morning." The photograph slipped from James's fingers. He didn't move to pick it up. He stood very still, the way a man stands when the ground has shifted under him, but hasn't fully decided whether to crack. His first thought was that she had wandered over from another part of the cemetery, that she had confused. Something misread a name, invented a story the way children sometimes do when they want attention from adults who look sad. His second thought arrived immediately behind the first, hot and sharp. She was not confused. She was 8 years old, and she was looking at him with the same steady certainty most adults never managed. "What did you just say to me?" His voice came out lower than intended. She did not flinch. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and pulled out a small photograph bent slightly at one corner, kept inside a plastic sleeve. She held it out. James's hand moved to take it before his mind gave the instruction. The photo showed a small living room. Old furniture, a braided rug on a wood floor, afternoon light coming through a window with no curtains. A thin boy stood barefoot on the rug holding a grilled cheese sandwich, with both hands smiling the careful smile of a child who has recently been frightened but is trying not to show it anymore. His hair was longer than James remembered, darker at the roots. His face was thinner. But the eyes were Noah's eyes. The shape of the jaw was Noah's jaw. The way he held the sandwich, tilted slightly to one side, was something James had watched 100 times at his own kitchen table. James's hands began to shake. "That was taken 3 weeks ago," the girl said. "In our kitchen. My name is Lily. My granddaddy takes care of this cemetery. I come here after school sometimes. I've seen you before. You always come alone. You always talk to this grave." James looked up from the photograph slowly. His mouth opened, then closed. The part of him that processed information in columns and risk-weighted every variable had gone very quiet. What was left was something older and less organized. "Who are you? How do you have this?" "My mama took it. She told me to keep it in case I saw you again. She said the man who comes alone every week holding the little boat might be the father." Lily looked at the photograph in his hands, then at the stone. "She said if I saw you, I should tell you the truth." James crouched down to her eye level. It was not a thing he planned, his knees simply bent. He held the photograph out so they could both see it. "This child, his name." His voice was careful, stripped of everything except the question. "Do you know his name?" "He says his name is Noah. He says his daddy is named James Whitfield. He says his daddy travels a lot for work, but he always comes home." The pressure behind James's eyes was sudden and enormous. He looked down at the gravel and breathed through his nose 3 times before he could look back up. He tapped the headstone with 2 fingers. "His name is right here, carved in stone. My son died. There were hospital records. There was a death certificate. There was a funeral." Lily looked at the headstone, then at him. She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then she said, "My granddaddy says names on stones don't always mean the person is really there." A slow crunch of gravel announced the arrival of someone from the direction of the maintenance shed. An older black man walked toward them across the grass, carrying his work gloves in one hand. His posture unhurried but deliberate, the walk of someone who had covered this ground so many times he no longer needed to look at it. He was in his mid-60s, lean, with a face that had absorbed a great deal without cracking. He stopped beside Lily and looked at James with recognition, the way a person looks at someone they have observed but never spoken to. "Mr. Whitfield," the man said. Not a question, a confirmation. "My name is Walter. I've worked here 32 years. James stood up. "You know who I am." "I know who you are. I've watched you come here every week since this stone went in." Walter turned his gaze to the headstone. His expression did not change, but something moved through it, a shadow of something that had been sitting in him for a long time. "There's something I should have said a year ago. I didn't say it because a man in my position doesn't challenge people like the ones who came to arrange this burial. I've regretted that silence every single week." James was very still. Walter looked at him directly, no hesitation, no performance. "The coffin they brought here, the day of the burial, it was too light." He paused to let the words reach James before continuing. "I have been lowering coffins into this ground since I was 30 years old. I know what a child's coffin weighs. I know what that weight means, what it feels like in your hands and your back. That coffin felt like wood and air, nothing else." The October cold seemed to deepen. James heard it the way a man hears the sound of ice breaking under his feet the moment before the fall. "Who brought it?" His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Your brother-in-law. He came with 2 men from the funeral home. Paid in cash, told me it was a private burial closed casket, not to open it under any circumstances. Said the family preferred no witnesses." Walter's jaw tightened. Poor men keep their jobs by not asking rich men questions. I told myself I was wrong about the weight. I told myself grief was making me imagine things. He looked at the ground. I was not imagining things. James turned away from both of them. He took 3 steps toward the oak trees, stopped, stood there with his back to the stone, looking at nothing in particular. 11 months. Every week. Talking to an empty grave. The shape of the year rearranged itself in his mind. Every grief counselor's phrase, every well-meaning colleague's hand on his shoulder every night. He had sat in Noah's room in the dark, all of it now lit from underneath by something that was not grief at all. It was something colder, something that had been true the entire time while he was busy believing a lie. He turned back, looked at Lily. "You said he lives with you." "Yes, sir." "The scar." James touched his own left eyebrow, just above the left eye. Small, thin, follows the line of the brow. He watched her face. Does he have that? Lily nodded without hesitation. He told me a dog scratched him when he was little. He said it was a neighbor's dog and it happened so fast he didn't even cry until after. James looked at the photograph in his hand one more time. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it into his inside coat pocket next to the one he had brought, and looked at Lily. Take me to him. The drive across Columbus took 20 minutes. James followed Lily's directions through the rearview mirror, her small face appearing between the front seats, navigating him from the quiet manicured streets near the cemetery, through an older part of the city where the buildings grew smaller and closer together, where storefront signs had been repainted over earlier signs, where the sidewalks held old cracks like fault lines no one had gotten around to fixing. He had driven these streets before knew the cross-sections of this city the way he knew most things from the outside in. He had never had reason to stop here. He parked in front of a narrow house on Delmore Street. The paint was a faded blue peeling at the corners. The porch tilted slightly to the right. A plastic tricycle sat in the yard, one wheel turned up. Beside the front steps, a clay pot held the dry remains of summer flowers no one had emptied out yet. James got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He was 42 years old. He had negotiated contracts worth more than most people would see in their lives. He had stood in rooms full of hostile investors and said things calmly that he did not feel calmly. He was not prepared for the terror of walking up those four porch steps. Lily went first, pushed open the screen door, called inside. A woman appeared in the doorway, early 30s, wearing a diner uniform, an apron still around her waist, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of double shifts and early mornings. She looked at James the way Ruth Henderson looked at most things that appeared unexpectedly at her door, directly, without warmth but without cruelty, simply assessing. Her eyes moved from his face to his coat to his shoes and back to his face. She did not step aside. "Mama," Lily said, "this is Mr. Whitfield, the man from the cemetery, the one I told you about." Ruth looked at him for a long beat. "You got identification." James reached into his coat, produced his wallet, held out his driver's license. Ruth looked at it, then at his face matching the photo. She handed it back. "Why should I believe you're who you say you are? The people who put that boy in the place he ran from, they had paperwork too." The observation landed without apology. James absorbed it. "That's fair. I have a photograph." He reached into his inside pocket and brought out the backyard photo, Noah on his shoulders, both of them laughing. "His name is Noah James Whitfield. He's 6. He has a birthmark on his right shoulder blade, shaped roughly like a question mark. He sleeps on his left side always. He is afraid of ceiling fans when they're on high speed and has been since he was 3. He calls grilled cheese sandwiches the good sandwich." Something shifted in Ruth's face. Not all the way, not a complete opening, but a recognition that widened her eyes slightly before she controlled it. She stepped aside and let him in. The living room was small but ordered. A couch with a crocheted blanket folded over the back, a coffee table with a few scuffs along its edge, a shelf along one wall that held children's books, and a few toys arranged with the careful attention of a person who maintains order because the alternative costs too much. James's eye moved over the shelf and stopped. On the second shelf sat a small red plastic boat. Not a new one purchased somewhere as a replacement. This one had the same chip in the paint, the same scuff along the hull. James had not known there was a second boat. He had been carrying the one from his jacket pocket for 11 months, believing it was the last one. This one had traveled with Noah, had been hidden from the people at Northridge who took his other things, had made the journey from wherever they had put his son to the shelf in this small living room on Delmore Street. Ruth watched him see it. She said nothing. From somewhere down the hallway, the sound of a pencil moving against paper. Soft, rhythmic, a child's careful work. James turned toward the hallway without deciding to. Ruth put a hand up, not blocking him, just pausing him. "Before you go in there." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "That child has been through something that grown adults wouldn't survive without help. He doesn't trust easily. He builds walls and he builds them fast. You do not get to walk in there and take him back like a lost package. You walk in there like a father. Whatever that means for you, figure it out in the next 30 seconds. James looked at her. "What did he tell you about me?" "He said you were always busy. He said you traveled a lot." She held his gaze. "He said you promised him you wouldn't disappear. He said that every time he thought you weren't coming, He reminded himself you'd never lied to him before, so something else had to be wrong. James pressed his lips together. He nodded once. He turned toward the hallway. The door at the end was half open, spilling a rectangle of warm light onto the worn carpet. James walked the length of that hallway slowly, each step quieter than the last. He reached the doorway and stood at the edge of it. A small desk sat against the wall beneath the window. A single lamp on the desk, its shade slightly crooked. On the desk, a workbook opened flat, several sheets of paper alongside it, a pencil moving across one of them in concentrated loops. A boy sat in the chair, bent forward, his weight on his left elbow, his face angled down. Taller than James remembered. Thinner. Hair longer, curling slightly at the back of his neck. The particular angle of his shoulder blades when he concentrated, that was identical to the boy James had watched do homework at the kitchen table on Meridian Drive. James stood in the doorway and could not speak. Noah's pencil stopped. The instinct children have, that awareness of being watched. It reached him before James made a sound. Noah looked up. The two of them looked at each other across the small room. Noah's face did the thing that faces do when the brain is processing something faster than it can categorize. His eyes moved across James the way James had moved across the cemetery plot, searching for something that didn't add up. His brow furrowed. His grip on the pencil tightened. James did not move closer. He understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with his professional experience and everything to do with the years of bath time and nighttime and Saturday mornings, that the next thing he said would be measured against every story this child had been told for the past year. It could not be loud. It could not be large. James said quietly the single word he had used since Noah learned to walk. "Hey, buddy." The pencil fell from Noah's hand. It rolled to the edge of the desk and dropped onto the floor. Noah watched it fall and did not pick it up. His mouth had opened slightly. The expression on his face was one James had never seen before. On those features, a collision of things too big for a 6-year-old face recognition fighting against the wall that 12 months of someone else's lies had built brick by careful brick. Noah stood up from the chair slowly. He did not run. He crossed the room in small steps, stopping 3 feet from James, looking up at him with the scrutiny of a child who has been burned and is checking the stove before deciding whether it's safe. He looked at James's face, then at his hands, then back at his face. James did not reach for him. He waited. Noah took one more step. Then he reached out and took hold of the sleeve of James's coat. Not his hand, not his arm, the sleeve, the fabric, the edge of it. He held on. His knuckles went white. James placed his hand very gently over Noah's hand and held it there, covering it completely. He felt the small fingers underneath. The room was very quiet. Down the hallway, Ruth and Lily stood without speaking. Neither of them moved. James lowered himself to one knee so he was at Noah's height. He kept his hand over Noah's. His voice, when it came, was not steady, but it was honest, which was the only thing that mattered now. "I didn't know where you were. I was told you were gone. If anyone had told me the truth, any single person had told me the truth, I would have come the first day. Not the second day, the first." Noah looked at him for a long time. The kind of long time that only children have access to, unself-conscious, unrushed measuring, something they have no language for. Then he asked the question he had apparently been saving for a year, simple, with no decoration. "You didn't leave me." 3 words. The weight of all 12 months in 3 words. James shook his head. "No, I did not leave you. I was lied to. And I am more sorry than I have ever been for anything in my life, that it took me this long to find you." Something in Noah's face shifted, cracked slightly the way ice cracks before it gives way completely. He did not cry, not yet. Maybe the walls were still too thick for that. But he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against James's shoulder, and James wrapped both arms around his son and stayed there, not moving, not rushing it, not doing anything except being exactly where he was. Later, the 4 of them sat at Ruth's kitchen table, Noah and Lily with grilled cheese sandwiches. James with a cup of coffee he didn't remember being poured. The table was small, the kitchen was small, the overhead light hummed slightly. It was nothing like James's kitchen on the north side of Columbus, with its Italian stone counters and its silence. It felt in a way that James could not organize into language, like something had been switched back on. Ruth kept her voice low while the children ate. She told James the story from the beginning, the night last January behind the Kroger on 5th Street, the snow on the ground, the sound of coughing from behind the dumpsters. Noah had tried to run when he saw her, convinced she was from the facility. convinced any adult coming toward him was coming to bring him back to the white walls and the locked doors. He fought hard to get away. Ruth said no judgment in it, only fact. A small boy fighting a grown woman in a parking lot in the snow. That's what he thought his options were. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I brought him home. I fed him. He had a fever for 8 days. My father, Walter, drove to the pharmacy 3 nights in a row. He slept in Lily's room. She slept on the couch and never complained once. James looked at Lily across the table. She was focused on her sandwich, apparently not listening, but he saw the slight tilt of her head that meant she was tracking every word. When the fever broke, Ruth continued, he started talking. He told us your name. He told us the company Whitfield Group. He told us about the house and the car and the backyard. He told us about Frankfurt, that you went to Frankfurt, and then something happened and you never came back. She met James's eyes. He never said you didn't love him. Not once. He said something went wrong. He said you would figure it out. James set the coffee cup down. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at them. The hands that had been within 60 miles of his son for 11 months while he stood at a grave talking to carved stone. Noah looked up from his sandwich. His voice was practical, the way children are practical when they have decided to move forward. Are you going to be here tomorrow? James looked at his son. Yes. Are you going to leave again? Not like before. Noah considered this chewing. He looked at Lily. Lily looked back at him. Some communication passed between them that adults were not invited into. Then Noah looked back at James. Lily said you were a good man. She said she could tell because you talked to the grave every week. She said bad dads don't talk to graves. James looked at Lily. Lily shrugged very slightly as if this was simply an observation she had made and stood behind. James said she was right to make you wait. She was right not to tell you right away. She was protecting you. Noah nodded. He reached across the table and picked up the red boat from where he had set it while James wasn't watching. He turned it over in his hands. I kept this the whole time. At Northridge, they took the other things, but I hid this one. He looked at it quietly for a moment. I talked to it. At night when I couldn't sleep. I told it you were coming. The sentence went into James's chest like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a year. After the children went to wash up, James sat alone with Ruth for a few minutes. He asked her about Northridge Children's Home. She told him what Noah had described the intake process, the locked dormitory doors after 8 in the evening, the staff member who had told him specifically and more than once that his father had been informed of his placement and had not responded, that his father was busy with important work, that some fathers, when children were sick, a lot found it difficult to make the necessary adjustments. James heard his sister's voice in those words. The particular softness Carol had always used when she was delivering something cruel wrapped in something that sounded like concern. He had heard it his whole childhood. He had always found a way to believe the concern was real. He looked out Ruth's kitchen window at the yard behind the house, a square of dead autumn grass, a clothesline, a neighbor's fence. He thought about the sequence of things that had been done and the particular coldness required to execute each step, while a child was still alive in the same house, still calling the people who were planning it by family names. Noah's voice came from the hallway asking Lily something about a board game. James heard Lily's answer, brisk and slightly bossy. He heard Noah laugh. James had spent 11 months unable to remember what that sound was like. Now it was in the next room. He stood up from the table. He thanked Ruth. He said he would come back in the morning and the morning after that until they figured out the right next step for Noah without rushing it or dragging the boy from the only safe place he had known in a year. Ruth watched his face while he said this, and apparently found something in it worth accepting because she nodded without argument. He said goodbye to Lily and to Noah at the door. Noah held the red boat at his side. He looked up at James with those same eyes James had looked into across a hospital room bassinet 6 years ago, the night everything in his life had reorganized itself around a single new priority. James said, I'll be here tomorrow, same time. Noah said, okay. Then he added very quietly, I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't you. James walked to his car. He sat behind the wheel without starting it. He looked through the windshield at the blue house, with its tilted porch and its clay pot of dead flowers and its interior full of people who had done an extraordinary thing, for no reason except that a child had needed it. He thought about his sister Carol. He thought about the way she had called him in Frankfurt, her voice breaking just the right amount, the way she had managed the hospital name, and the sequence of symptoms with the practiced fluency of someone who had rehearsed. He thought about Dennis standing behind her at the funeral with his hand on her shoulder, wearing the exact expression of a man supporting a grieving sister-in-law. He thought about Noah behind the dumpster in January snow, fighting to run from a woman trying to help him, because every adult he had encountered in the preceding months had given him reasons not to trust. James started the car. He drove north through the city, through the neighborhoods that shaded from worn to polished as the addresses climbed. He drove without the radio. By the time he turned into the long driveway of his house, the sky had gone fully dark. He sat in the car for a moment before going in. The house was lit from inside, warm and large and quiet, the way expensive things are quiet. It was the same house it had always been. It looked entirely different now. He went directly to his office, sat at his desk, took out a legal pad, and wrote one sentence at the top of the page, pressing hard enough that the words left an impression on the pages beneath. Then he opened his desk drawer, found the business card for Frank Donovan that had been sitting there for 3 years untouched, and set it on the desk beside the legal pad. He looked at it for a long moment. Not yet. First, he needed to understand the full shape of what had been done. He needed to see it with his own eyes before he handed it to anyone else. He reached into his pocket and set the red boat on the desk in the center of everything, where he could not look past it. Then he picked up his pen, turned to a fresh page, and began to write a list of names. James drove to Harmon Medical Center alone on a Wednesday morning before he called Frank, before he told anyone what he was doing. He had spent 20 years watching other men hand their problems to other people the moment the problems became uncomfortable, and he had watched those problems return larger, shaped by someone else's understanding of them. He needed to see the edges of this himself first. He parked in the visitor structure, walked through the main entrance, found the medical records office on the second floor. The woman behind the counter explained that records requests required formal written authorization, valid photo identification, a completed release form, and in the case of deceased patients, additional documentation establishing the relationship of the requesting party to the deceased. James listened to all of it. Then he said, "My son was a patient here approximately 13 months ago. His name was Noah James Whitfield. I need to know the name of his attending physician." The woman typed. She looked at the screen. She typed again. A small vertical line appeared between her brows. "I'm showing a file under that name, but the attending physician listed has not been on our active staff for over 3 years." She stopped herself, aware she had already said more than the policy allowed. "You'll need to submit the formal request, Mr. Whitfield." He thanked her. He wrote down the name of the physician she had inadvertently confirmed before catching herself. He walked back to his car, sat in it for 4 minutes, then drove to Greenfield Funeral Home on the east side of Bexley. A man in a gray suit met James in the reception area with an expression calibrated precisely to the midpoint between sympathy and professionalism. James introduced himself, gave Noah's name, gave the approximate date of the burial, said he was the father, said he was reviewing the arrangements for personal reasons. The man went to check the records. He was gone longer than he should have been for a simple retrieval. When he returned, his expression had shifted slightly. He explained that the arrangement had been made by a family representative, that it had been a private service closed casket, and that the documentation on file was complete on their end. James asked to see the body transfer record from the hospital. The standard form confirming that remains had been received from the medical facility. The man looked at the file in his hands, then at James, then back at the file. He said that particular form was not included in the documentation he had in front of him. He said there might be additional paperwork in storage. He said they would need to look into it. There was no form. James understood that from the shape of the silence around the man's explanation. There was no form because there had been no transfer, because there had been nothing to transfer. He thanked the man, declined the offer to follow up by phone, walked back to his car, added 3 lines to his legal pad, then called Frank Donovan. Frank picked up on the second ring. His voice had the quality of a man who had never fully retired from paying attention to things alert in a way that had become structural rather than conscious. James told him he needed help, gave him the short version, stayed with the facts, kept the emotion out of his voice, the way he had learned to keep it out of his voice in boardrooms where showing the wrong thing at the wrong moment cost real money. When he finished, Frank was quiet for several seconds. "I'm going to need 48 hours, Frank said, not phrasing it as a request. "Don't go back to either of those places. Don't call your sister. Don't let her know you're moving." James said he understood. "One more thing. Frank's voice dropped slightly. Whatever you think this is right now, be prepared for it to be worse. The 48 hours were the longest James had spent since the week after Frankfurt. He went to Ruth's house both mornings. He sat on the floor of the small living room with Noah building things out of wooden blocks a city. According to Noah, a series of increasingly unstable towers according to physics. Lily supervised from the couch with the authority of someone who had been managing Noah's architectural ambitions for nearly a year. She pointed out structural flaws without being asked. Noah argued with her about every one of them, then quietly incorporated her corrections. James watched the two of them without inserting himself too much, learning the texture of what Noah's life had become. He watched how Noah moved through the house, comfortable with its smallness, comfortable with Ruth's schedule, comfortable with the particular rhythms of a household that had very little but ran on consistency. There was a Tuesday night routine involving a specific television program, a bowl of popcorn shared between the children, Ruth folding laundry on the couch. Noah had been shaped by these rituals the way water takes the shape of what holds it. On the second morning, Noah asked James, directly sitting cross-legged on the floor with a block in each hand, "Did you look for me after?" James had rehearsed nothing. He said what was true. "I went to the grave every week. I thought that was the only place you were. I didn't know to look anywhere else because the people who told me what happened were people I had trusted my whole life." He held Noah's gaze. "I stopped looking in the right direction because I believed the wrong people. That was my failure, not yours." Noah was quiet for a moment, turning a block over in his hands. "I didn't stop looking for you. I looked for you every day in people's faces." He set the block down on top of the tower with unusual care, as if the weight of the conversation had made him more precise. "I didn't find you, but I kept looking." The tower held. Lily made a sound of mild surprise. James kept his eyes on his son and did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Frank called on the Thursday morning. James stepped into the hallway while Noah helped Lily clear the breakfast table, and Frank delivered the results the way he had always delivered difficult information in sequence, without cushioning, because cushioning never actually softened anything. The medical file at Harmon bore the signature of Dr. Raymond Cosley, who had retired from the hospital's staff 3 years prior. His name had been used on Noah's admission forms, his credentials attached to a record he had never created, his signature reproduced on documents he had never seen. This was not a clerical error. Using a retired physician's credentials on a fraudulent file required either access to internal hospital records or a cooperating party inside the system. Frank had a name but needed another day to confirm it. The death certificate listed the cause of death as acute respiratory failure, secondary to pneumonia. The certifying physician was not Cosley. It was Dennis Marsh. James pressed his back against the hallway wall when Frank said this. Dennis was not a physician. Dennis ran a mid-sized commercial property firm on the west side of Columbus. His signature on a death certificate was not a bureaucratic anomaly. It was a felony under Ohio Revised Code, the kind that carried mandatory prison exposure regardless of whatever else was attached to it. The funeral home records confirmed no body transfer documentation. Greenfield had accepted a sealed casket, processed a cash payment, filed the burial permit using the fraudulent death certificate, closed the file. The person listed as the arranging family representative was Carol Whitfield Marsh. James did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the closed kitchen door, listened to the sound of Noah asking Lily where the dish soap was heard. Lily's reply heard Noah laugh at something in the answer. Frank kept going. Northridge Children's Home had admitted a child under the name Noah Whitfield 3 days after the death certificate was filed. The intake paperwork listed the child's legal guardians as Carol Whitfield Marsh and Dennis Marsh. The reason for placement, father deceased, mother unknown child, requires supervised long-term care for ongoing respiratory health concerns. The form was signed by Carol. A secondary authorization form required by Ohio's child placement statutes for non-parental guardianship was signed by Dennis. Both signatures dated within 72 hours of the death certificate filing. The sequence was not a sequence of panic. Panic produced gaps, inconsistencies, things done out of order by hands that were shaking. This sequence was clean. Each document had been prepared in the correct order. Each signature appeared in the right place. Whoever had assembled these pieces had understood the system well enough to know exactly which forms needed, which signatures, in which order to produce a legally uncontestable record. "There's something else," Frank said. "I pulled financial records from 2 accounts connected to Whitfield Group's secondary trust structure, the one that carries Noah's inheritance provisions. Money moved from those accounts to a private medical administrative consulting firm 11 weeks before the death certificate was filed. A pause. I found an email chain between Dennis and a lawyer named Gerald Stein. The relevant line verbatim: once the death is filed, trust control reverts within 90 days. The board won't question a grieving uncle. 11 weeks before the death certificate. James calculated backward. That meant the planning began in September of the previous year. Noah had been alive and living in James's house in September. James had been in Columbus in September. He had taken Noah to a Columbus Clippers game that month, the boy on his shoulders in the upper deck reaching for a foam finger, laughing at the mascot. The plan had been in motion during that game. Dennis had been moving money while James was buying his son a hot dog at a minor league baseball stadium. James stood in the hallway of Ruth Henderson's house and felt something solidify in his chest. Not the sharp heat of immediate anger, but something colder, more structural, the kind of cold that doesn't dissipate. They started this before anything changed, James said. Before any paperwork was filed, before any conversation about the trust structure. They decided to do this, and then they built the infrastructure to make it happen. That's what it looks like, Frank said. This isn't a family dispute that went too far. This is premeditated fraud, possibly more than fraud. I'm going to see Carol today. James, I'm not bringing lawyers. I'm not recording it. I'm going to look at her and ask her why. A long pause. What do you hear in that room? It doesn't go anywhere officially unless you've got paper behind it. I know, I just need to see her face. He went to Carol's house that afternoon. He did not call ahead. He drove to the neighborhood where Carol had lived for 9 years, the wide lots, the mature trees, the houses that announced themselves without ostentation, the specific quiet of streets where money was old enough to be comfortable. He had been to this house for birthdays, for Thanksgiving, for the 4th of July. He had watched Noah run across that front lawn chasing a sprinkler. Carol opened the door before he reached it. She must have seen the car from a window. Her face assembled itself into the expression James had been watching his entire life, the one she deployed when she knew a difficult conversation was coming, but had decided in advance to manage it. The warmth turned up slightly above natural, the eyes carrying a preloaded sympathy. She stepped forward to hug him. James let her. He did not return it. He stepped inside. The living room was the same as always, decorated with the careful intention of someone who wanted visitors to feel that a loving family lived here. Dennis was standing by the fireplace with a glass of water in his hand, raised slightly in a greeting, calibrated to appear casual. The calculation behind it was visible only if you were looking, and James was looking at everything now. James sat in the chair across from the couch. He did not take off his coat. Carol sat on the couch. Dennis moved to sit beside her, an action that looked like support, but functioned as positioning. The room went through its social motions for approximately 40 seconds. Carol beginning sentences about the week, about the weather, about how she had been thinking of calling. James let it run. Then he said, I found Noah. The glass in Dennis's hand went perfectly still. Carol's mouth was still partially open from her last sentence. The expression on her face did not collapse immediately. It held for a fraction of a second longer than a genuine reaction would have held, the way a structure holds briefly after the foundation gives, before the laws of physics catch up. Carol's voice, when it came, was thin but controlled. What are you talking about? James placed the photograph on the coffee table between them. The photo Lily had given him, Noah standing barefoot in Ruth's living room with the sandwich, the shy, careful smile. He turned it so it faced Carol. Carol looked at the photograph. Dennis looked at it. Neither of them reached for it. James said nothing. He let the silence do the work that accusations couldn't. Dennis recovered first, the professional reflex of a man who had spent a career managing situations. His voice was measured, positioned somewhere between concerned and skeptical. James, you've been grieving for a year. Sometimes people see things they want to see. James reached into his coat, placed the email printout on the table beside the photograph. The chain between Dennis and Gerald Stein. The line Frank had found. He watched Dennis's eyes move to the paper. He watched the moment Dennis recognized what he was reading. Dennis did not finish the sentence he had started. Carol looked at the paper. Then she looked at Dennis. The look lasted less than 2 seconds, but it contained an entire vocabulary James had never been meant to learn. It was not the look of a woman who had been drawn into something by her husband and was now facing the consequences. It was the look of a partner checking whether the other partner was going to hold the line. James watched her make the same decision she had apparently made 11 weeks before a fraudulent death certificate was filed. She turned back to him, her eyes filling with tears that arrived with the practiced timing of long use. You were never there, James. You were on a plane every other week. That child was sick, constantly, needed someone every day, needed attention. You weren't capable of giving because you built a life that didn't have room for the parts that couldn't be scheduled. The tears were real, James believed that much. He believed Carol had constructed a story in which she was the protagonist of a difficult decision, rather than the architect of a crime, that she had told herself that story enough times, that the grief she felt was genuine, even if the action underneath it was not. This did not alter anything. It only explained the particular texture of the damage. Dennis made the mistake of speaking from a place of recovered confidence. The boy was placed in a supervised facility where he received proper care. What we did was not ideal, but the motivation was. James turned his gaze to Dennis. Something in that gaze caused Dennis to stop mid-sentence, the way a person stops walking when they realize the ground ahead is not solid. James said he kept in the red boat. At Northridge, they took his other things, but he hid the boat. He talked to it at night in the dark because he thought it reminded him of me. A 6-year-old boy held onto a plastic toy for a year because he believed his father would come. He paused long enough to let the image settle into the room. You told him I chose not to. You made him practice believing his father abandoned him until he could say it out loud without crying. Carol covered her face with both hands. Dennis looked at the fireplace. James stood up. He buttoned his coat. He picked up the email printout, left the photograph on the table. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back one final time. His voice was the same temperature it had been for the entire conversation, level not raised, not broken. You didn't just steal from me. You tried to rewrite who I was inside a child who was too young to know he was being lied to. Whatever comes next, you should know that is the part I will never be finished with. He drove back to the north side of Columbus. He went to his office. He sat at his desk for a long time without turning on the lights, the city visible through the glass behind him, the last of the October daylight fading from the skyline. He thought about September. He thought about the Clippers game. He thought about Noah reaching for the foam finger. He thought about the particular arithmetic of 4 days, how 4 fewer days in Frankfurt would have changed everything, how he had been 4 days away from a different version of this year, and how that knowledge was something he would have to carry without letting it hollow him out. Then he turned on his desk lamp, picked up the phone, called the non-emergency line for Columbus Police Department's Major Crimes Division, was transferred twice, reached an officer who took his name, his number, a brief preliminary statement, and told him a detective would be in contact within 24 hours. He hung up. He set the phone down. He reached into his desk drawer, picked up the red boat Noah had pressed into his hands that morning, held it in both palms. Noah had said before James left Ruth's house that evening, sitting on the porch steps with his shoes untied, the way they were always untied. Dad, whatever you're going to do it for you too, not just for me. You look sad at the grave every week for a long time. James had looked at his son for a moment before answering. I was sad, but I'm not sad anymore. He tightened his hands around the small plastic boat. I'm focused. Noah had considered this with the unhurried seriousness of someone who had recently learned that words were not always what they appeared to be. Then he said, my teacher says that's the right kind of angry. In the office now, James set the red boat on the desk in the center of everything. The contracts, the files, the legal pad, with its list of names, placed it where he would see it first, no matter what else was in front of him. He pulled the legal pad toward him and began writing again. Not the list of names this time, but a timeline starting from the Clippers game in September of the prior year. Working forward through Frankfurt, through the phone call from Carol, through the funeral he had arrived too late to attend, and had never questioned, through 11 months of Wednesdays at a gravel path in Lakeview Memorial Cemetery. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, the timeline covered 4 pages. He read it through once, slowly looking for the places where something was being obscured, where the language was designed to move attention away from the thing that mattered most. He found one entry that stopped him. His own name, mid-October of the previous year, 2 weeks before Noah disappeared. He had been in Columbus that week. He had taken Noah to the Clippers game on a Thursday. On the Friday, he had flown to Charlotte for a conference. He had spoken to Noah by video call on the Sunday. 4 days later, he was in Frankfurt for the signing. 4 days. He sat with the arithmetic of it for a while. Then he closed the legal pad, put it in the desk drawer, and turned off the lamp. Outside Columbus went on doing what cities do at night, unaware of the specific shape of the thing that had been set in motion in this particular office. The detective from Major Crimes would call in the morning. Frank would have the final confirmed name from inside Harmon's records by the weekend. The legal machinery was engaging its gears slow at first, then faster, the way those things always moved once the first document was filed. James stood, walked to the window, looked out at the lights. He thought about Noah on the floor of Ruth's kitchen that evening, drawing with crayons, while Lily read beside him, their shoulders almost touching the easy proximity of children who had spent a year negotiating the same small space. Noah had shown James the drawing before he left. 3 houses, different sizes, stick figures standing in the space between all 3, holding hands in a line. Noah had pointed to the figures one by one. This is you. This is me. This is Lily. This is Ruth. This is Walter. He had looked up at James with complete seriousness. We're supposed to be between all the houses, not just in one. James had folded the drawing and put it in his coat pocket. He reached into his pocket, now took out the drawing, unfolded it under the desk lamp. 3 houses, 5 stick figures, a child's precise vision of what a family was supposed to look like when it had been through something and come out the other side. He folded it again, put it back. James Whitfield turned off the desk lamp, left the red boat where it was in the center of everything, and walked out of his office into the large, quiet house that was about to become something different than it had been for a very long time. Detective Lisa Chen arrived at James's office on a Friday morning with a legal pad, a recorder, a paper cup of coffee. She sat on the edge of his desk without asking, in the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent years listening to what is said directly alongside what is carefully left out. She was in her early 40s, precise in the way that good investigators are. Precise, not rigid, but economical. No motion wasted, no word offered that wasn't doing a specific job. Her partner, Roy Garrett, took the chair near the window and wrote things down without looking at the paper, his eyes on James the entire time. James had prepared nothing to say. He had learned over 20 years of negotiation that prepared statements were visible as prepared statements, that the seams showed that people who needed to believe you could always detect the gap between what was rehearsed and what was real. He told them what had happened in the order it had happened, starting with the cemetery, moving through Lily's photograph, through Walter's statement about the coffin, through Ruth's kitchen, through his own visits to Harmon and Greenfield, through Frank's findings, through the conversation at Carol's house. He did not editorialize. He did not tell them what to conclude. He gave them sequence and let the sequence speak. Chen asked questions that cut sideways into the narrative rather than following it forward, the technique of someone checking whether the story held from multiple angles. She asked about the trust structure, about when Noah's inheritance provisions had been established, about who had access to the documentation. She asked about James's travel schedule in the months before Frankfurt. She asked whether Carol had ever prior to all of this expressed concern about James's parenting in terms that now seemed retrospectively calculated. James thought about a phone call in August of the prior year. Carol's voice gentle in the way it was always gentle when she was building towards something, saying she had been worried about Noah at the last family dinner, that the boy seemed quiet, that children needed stability, that James might want to think about whether his schedule was sustainable for a child with ongoing health needs. He had thanked her for her concern. He had told her he was working on it. He had gotten on a plane to Charlotte 4 days later. He told Chen about the call. He watched her write it down. Frank delivered the final confirmed piece on the Saturday. A records administrator at Harmon named Stuart Pelham had been the cooperating party inside the hospital system. Frank had traced a payment of $11,000 from a holding account connected to Dennis's commercial property firm to a personal account belonging to Pelham, transferred in 2 installments in the weeks before Noah's fraudulent admission was filed. Pelham had accessed the credentials of the retired Dr. Cosley through the hospital's legacy record system, a database that retained the login infrastructure of former staff members without deactivating it. He had created the file, attached Cosley's credentials, processed it through the system as a legitimate admission. Chen obtained the warrant for Pelham's records on the following Monday. The warrant for Carol's financial accounts came through the same afternoon. Dennis's accounts were frozen by Tuesday morning. Carol called James on Tuesday evening. He looked at the phone until it stopped ringing. He looked at it again when it rang a second time 15 minutes later. He let it ring. There was nothing Carol could say to him on a phone call that would serve the process now underway, or the child sleeping in the boat-shaped bed in the room at the end of the upstairs hallway. Noah had moved in the previous Thursday, not all at once, not with any ceremony, but incrementally, bringing the red boat first, then his backpack, then a specific blanket Ruth had given him, because he had slept under it for 11 months, and his body had memorized its weight. The night Noah moved in, he had stood in the doorway of his room for a long time before going inside. The room was unchanged, the bookshelf, the framed drawing, the bed with its navy coverlet. Noah looked at the drawing on the wall, the one he had made when he was 5. The stick figures in front of the very square house with the crayon sun in the corner. He walked to it, stood in front of it, examined it with the critical eye of an artist reviewing early work. James watched from the doorway. Noah said, "I draw better now." He turned around. "But I like that I made it." James told him they would keep it on the wall as long as Noah wanted it there. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied, turned back to the room, went to the desk, set the red boat next to the lamp, sat on the bed to test the mattress with both hands, stood up, sat on it again. He seemed to be reaching a verdict. Eventually, he looked at James with the expression of someone who has completed an assessment. "It still feels like mine." James said it always was. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of November. By then, the case file had grown to a volume that required its own cart when Chen brought it to the courthouse. Stuart Pelham had entered a guilty plea in exchange for cooperation, providing a sworn statement that confirmed Dennis had contacted him through a mutual acquaintance, had explained the broad shape of what was needed without using direct language, had relied on Pelham to understand what was being asked without it being said explicitly. This was, Chen explained to James, a common structure in cases like this, the insulating layer between the person who wanted the thing done and the person who did it. It made prosecution slightly more complex, but not substantially more difficult, because the money trail did not use euphemism. Money was direct in a way that people were not. James attended the preliminary hearing with Frank. He sat in the gallery, not at the table with his legal team, a choice his attorney had argued against. James had been firm. He was not the plaintiff in a business dispute. He was a father who needed to see what accountability looked like when it finally arrived in the same room as the people who had spent 11 months treating his son as a problem to be managed. Carol entered the courtroom with her attorney. She did not look at James. She looked at the floor in front of her feet with the focused attention of someone who had decided exactly how much of the room she was willing to take in at any given moment. She looked smaller than she had in her living room. Institutions had a way of doing that to people who had only ever operated within structures they controlled. Dennis walked in behind her. He had replaced whatever internal posture he had been managing since James appeared in his living room with something harder, the armor of a man who had decided that the path forward was through. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, spoke briefly to his attorney in a low tone. He did not look at James either. James watched both of them with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, now steady cataloging, waiting. The judge reviewed the charges: medical fraud, falsification of a death certificate, unlawful guardianship transfer, conspiracy, financial fraud in connection with a trust and inheritance structure, child endangerment. The list moved through the courtroom like something with weight. Carol's attorney entered a not guilty plea on her behalf. Dennis's attorney did the same. The judge set the trial date. James drove home from the courthouse alone. Noah was at school. Mrs. Alvarez had left dinner in the refrigerator and a note on the counter in her careful handwriting. James stood in the kitchen reading the note, which said only that Noah had eaten a full breakfast, had asked for extra orange juice, had remembered his backpack without being reminded. James folded the note and put it in the kitchen drawer where he had begun keeping the small accumulating evidence of ordinary life resuming. In the weeks between the preliminary hearing and the trial, James settled into a different version of his days. He drove Noah to school every morning. He was in the pickup line every afternoon 20 minutes before the bell. He cooked dinner more nights than Mrs. Alvarez did, badly at first, then less badly, Noah offering unsolicited commentary on every attempt with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften criticism out of social politeness. Lily came over on weekends. Ruth and Walter came for Sunday dinner twice in November, once in December. The house adjusted around them gradually, the rooms filling with the particular noise of people who were comfortable enough to be themselves in a space. Noah had nightmares sometimes. James heard them through the wall, the sound of a child talking urgently in his sleep, occasional sharp crying that stopped almost immediately. On those nights, James would open Noah's door and stand in the threshold, until the boy settled not going in unless Noah called for him, respecting the boundary between presence and intrusion. Noah never acknowledged these nighttime vigils in the morning. James understood this was its own form of communication, that the acknowledgement was in the fact of settling in, the knowledge that the threshold was occupied, that someone was there. One Saturday morning in late November, Noah came downstairs carrying a school project, a poster board covered in photographs and handwritten captions. The assignment was about family. James saw himself in 3 of the photographs, Noah on his shoulders in the backyard, the 2 of them at a Clippers game, a recent picture Ruth had taken of them on the porch of the Delmore Street house the previous weekend. He saw Ruth and Lily in 2 others. He saw Walter in one, standing in the cemetery in his work jacket, his hand on Lily's shoulder. There was no photograph of Carol. There was no photograph of Dennis. Noah had drawn a simple outline of a house in one corner of the poster and written beneath it in careful block letters, "The people who stayed." James looked at that caption for a long time without saying anything. Noah watched his face. "Is that okay?" Noah asked. "My teacher said it could be any kind of family." James nodded. "That's exactly right," he said. "Any kind of family." The trial began in early January, the new year, 2 weeks old Columbus, in the grip of the specific gray cold that settled over the Midwest like a verdict and stayed. James took Noah to school on the first morning of the trial, an ordinary Tuesday departure with a packed lunch and a reminder about a spelling test. Noah, standing on the school steps with his backpack straps in both hands, looked at James with the directness he had developed over the preceding months, the habit of saying what he was thinking without the circuitous approach that adults learn to use on each other. "Are you scared?" James considered the question honestly. "No, I'm ready." Noah appeared to test this response against something internal. "Okay," he said. "I'll see you at 3." He went inside. James stood on the steps for a moment after the door closed in the cold, in the noise of the school morning around him. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of it. The pickup time, the spelling test, the packed lunch. He turned toward the courthouse. The prosecution had structured its case with the precision that a file of that density required. The medical fraud was established first, Dr. Cosley appearing via video deposition, his expression carrying the controlled outrage of a man whose professional identity had been appropriated without his knowledge. Confirming he had not treated Noah, had not been employed at Harmon at the relevant time, had never signed the documents bearing his name. Pelham's cooperation provided the mechanism. The financial transfer established the motive for his participation. The death certificate occupied the second day. An expert in forensic document analysis walked the jury through the specific irregularities, the certification pathways that had been circumvented, the places where the chain of medical and legal authority had been forged rather than followed. Dennis's signature was on the certificate. His attorney attempted to construct a framework in which Dennis had signed under Carol's instruction, had believed he was completing paperwork for an already confirmed death, had not understood the legal implications of what he was doing. The attempt required the jury to accept that a man who had run a commercial property firm for 16 years did not understand the significance of signing a death certificate as the certifying authority when he was not a physician. The jury's faces suggested this was a difficult argument to accept. Walter testified on the third day. He walked to the stand the way he walked through the cemetery, without hurry, without performance, wearing the good jacket he apparently reserved for occasions that required it. The prosecutor asked him to describe the burial. Walter described it. He described the weight of the coffin. He described 32 years of knowing what a child's coffin felt like, because he had carried enough of them to understand the difference between the weight of a life ended and the weight of an object inside a box. Dennis's attorney cross-examined him on the precision of his recollection, on whether it was possible he was mistaken, on whether the passage of 13 months might have affected his memory of a detail as specific as weight. Walter looked at the attorney with the patience of a man who had been asked questions by people who underestimated him his entire life. "I am not a man who forgets the feeling of burying a child," Walter said. "In 32 years, I have never gotten that wrong." The courtroom was completely still for a moment after that sentence. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next thing, but the deeper quiet of people who have just heard something that cannot be unfollowed by anything ordinary. Ruth testified the following morning. She told the story of the parking lot, the snow, the sound of coughing from behind the dumpsters, the thin boy who tried to run. She described the first night, the fever, the soup, the way Noah had woken at 2 in the morning, speaking clearly into the dark of Lily's room, saying his father's name, saying James Whitfield worked at Whitfield Group, saying his father traveled but always came home. She described how she had sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and told Noah she heard him that she was listening, that he should go back to sleep. She had not known what she was going to do with the information yet. She had known that she was not going to discard it. Dennis's attorney did not cross-examine Ruth. The calculation was visible from the gallery. There was nothing to gain from attacking a woman who had taken a sick child in from a parking lot in January snow and fed him for 11 months without asking for anything in return. The recording Frank had located played on the fourth afternoon. Dennis's voice clear in the audio in conversation with Stuart Pelham, navigating the language of indirect instruction with the practiced ease of someone who had always kept himself one grammatical step removed from explicit statement. At one point, Pelham said the name referred to the Whitfield boy by name, and Dennis's response was the one Frank had flagged from the beginning. Keep him quiet, 90 days. That's all I need. The phrase moved through the courtroom differently than the documents had. Documents were paper, they required interpretation. They asked the jury to connect things intellectually. That sentence in Dennis's actual voice required nothing. It was a man reducing a 6-year-old child to a scheduling problem, a duration, a thing that needed to be kept out of sight until the paperwork caught up with the plan. Carol's face in that moment was the one James had been waiting for since the trial began. She was looking at the table in front of her, her hands folded on top of it, and when the recording ended, she did not look up. She stayed very still. James was watching her the way he watched things now, with the full inventory of his attention. And what he saw was not the performance of grief or the calculation of damage control. What he saw was something quieter, something that might have been the specific shame of a person confronting the distance between who they had believed they were and what the evidence had established they had done. These were not always the same confrontation, and when they arrived together, they tended to be thorough. James testified on the 5th day. His attorney had prepared him for the defense's likely approach, the questions about his travel schedule, his absences, the legitimate critiques of his availability as a father that Carol's attorney would attempt to leverage as context for the narrative that what Carol and Dennis had done, however illegal, had been motivated by genuine concern for Noah's welfare. James had listened to the preparation carefully. He had decided in advance to answer those questions truthfully. The prosecutor took him through the sequence he now knew by heart: the Frankfurt call, the grave lily in the cemetery Noah on Delmore Street. The investigation. James answered in plain language, without embellishment, without the rhetorical architecture of a man presenting a case. He was a father telling the truth, which was the only version of this testimony that would serve his son. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, she moved directly to the absences. How many days had he traveled in the 12 months before Noah's disappearance? James gave her the number. It was not a small number. How many dinners had he missed? He told her. How many school mornings? He told her that too. She asked whether it was fair to say that Noah had spent a significant portion of his young life waiting for a father who was elsewhere. James looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's true. I was gone too much. I missed too many mornings. I failed to be present in ways that a child deserved. That is a true statement." He paused. "It is also true that being an imperfect father does not give anyone on this earth the right to tell my son I chose not to come back. Those are two separate things, and I will not allow them to be used as the same argument." The defense attorney moved to her next question. The drawing entered the record on the afternoon of the 5th day. James's attorney introduced it as evidence of psychological impact on the child, a document produced voluntarily by Noah during his therapeutic sessions with the child psychologist the family court had appointed following the case's opening. 3 houses, 5 figures, the space between. The psychologist testified to what Noah had said when asked to explain it, the language a 6-year-old used to describe the architecture of a family that had been deliberately fractured and was working to become whole again. "We're supposed to be between all the houses. That's where families live, not inside just one thing." The attorney read the explanation aloud. The courtroom was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something simple has said something precise. James watched Carol when the drawing was described. He had been watching for a specific moment, not revenge, he was clear with himself about that distinction, but the moment when the reality of what had been done arrived inside the person who had done it in a form she could not redirect or rationalize. Carol was looking at the table again. Then her attorney leaned toward her, said something quiet, and Carol looked up. She looked at the drawing on the screen at the front of the courtroom. She looked at the three houses. She looked at the middle house, the medium-sized one in Noah's crayon, lines the house that was unmistakably the shape of her house on the street where Noah had run across the lawn chasing a sprinkler. Noah had drawn her house, had placed it in the center of the family he was describing, had drawn himself standing in the space between it and his father's house holding hands with the figures on both sides. He had done this after 11 months of being told his father didn't want him, after 11 months of locked dormitory doors, after finding safety in a parking lot in January snow. He had still drawn her house in the picture. A 6-year-old child had extended a forgiveness that no adult in that courtroom had earned, and Carol was looking at it, and she understood exactly what she was looking at. Carol put both hands over her face. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. She did not compose herself for a long time. Dennis stared at the wall above the jury box. His hands resting on the table had closed into fists. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. They returned on a Thursday afternoon in January, 3 weeks into the new year, the Columbus sky the same gray it had been since October, the city carrying its winter with the stoic patience of a place that had been through worse. Guilty, medical fraud, falsification of a vital record, unlawful guardianship transfer, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, child endangerment. Each count read aloud by the court clerk, each one landing in the room with the specific weight of things that had been true for a long time, finally being named in a place that could do something with the name. James sat in the gallery and heard each one. He did not feel triumph. He had known somewhere below the level of conscious thought that he would not feel triumph. That triumph was not the right shape for what this moment was. What he felt was closer to the release of a pressure that had been building since October, since the cemetery, since the gravel path, since a small photograph of a thin boy standing barefoot on a braided rug. Carol received 8 years. The judge noted in the sentencing statement the premeditated nature of the deception, the particular cruelty of targeting a child's relationship with a parent as a mechanism of financial gain, the sustained psychological harm to a minor. Dennis received 14 years. The judge's language for Dennis was more direct, noting his role as the primary architect of the scheme, the financial sophistication required to execute it, the recording that had established his awareness of exactly what he was doing to a specific child with a specific name. Neither of them spoke during sentencing. Carol looked at her hands. Dennis looked at nothing in particular, the careful blankness of a man who had decided that whatever he was feeling was not available for public viewing. James walked out of the courthouse into the January cold. Frank was beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The street was ordinary Columbus, going about its business in the way cities did, regardless of what was happening inside any particular building. James stood on the steps and breathed the cold air. Frank said, "It's done." James said, "This part is." He drove to Noah's school himself, arriving 20 minutes before the bell. He parked in the pickup line, which he had been doing every day since Noah came home, the daily 20-minute wait that he had come to understand not as an obligation, but as something he was choosing specifically over every other thing he could be doing with those 20 minutes. He sat in the car with the engine off, watching the school's front doors. When the bell rang, children appeared in clusters, the push of small bodies in winter coats carrying backpacks, the noise of it reaching him through the closed windows as a pleasant, undifferentiated sound. Noah came through the doors, third or fourth in a group, his backpack on both shoulders, his coat unzipped despite the cold, looking for the car before he looked for anything else. When he found it, his face did the thing it had started doing in the weeks since he had moved in, a specific settling, a visible release of something he had been carrying all day. Not anxiety exactly, but the effort of a child who had learned the hard way that the people who were supposed to show up sometimes didn't, and was still in the process of unlearning that lesson, one pickup at a time. He got in. The car door closed. The ordinary smell of his coat and his backpack filled the front seat. "Spelling test," James pulled out of the line. Noah held up 3 fingers on one hand. 3 wrong. But I got superfluous right, and Mrs. Garrett said almost nobody gets superfluous right. James said superfluous was a word that deserved to be right. Noah considered this, looking out the window at the passing Columbus streets. Then, "Did they say the words today in court?" James kept his eyes on the road. "Yes." Were the words bad? Yes, the words were bad for them. Noah was quiet for a moment. He watched a traffic light change. Is it finished now? James thought about what finished meant, about the things that would take years rather than verdicts to resolve, about the particular patience required to rebuild trust in a child who had been carefully taught to doubt it, about the morning routines that were still new enough to feel fragile, about the nightmares that still came occasionally, about the fact that Noah still sometimes stood in the doorway of a room before entering it, as if checking whether he was allowed. He thought about all of that and held it honestly. The part that needed a courtroom is finished, James said. The rest of it, we do together. Noah nodded with the practical acceptance of a child who understood that some answers were complete, even when they were not simple. The following Saturday, James took the full group to Lakeview Memorial Cemetery. Noah, Lily, Ruth, Walter. The morning was cold but clear, the first real sun Columbus had seen in weeks. The kind of winter light that was sharp rather than warm, that made edges visible and shadows long. They walked together from the iron gate to the corner by the oak trees, 5 people on a gravel path that James had walked alone for 11 months. Walter had brought tools. He had offered the previous week without being asked. James had accepted without discussion. Some things were understood between men of a certain age and experience without requiring the scaffolding of explanation. They stood in front of the headstone, the stone with Noah James Whitfield carved into it, the stone that had been the geography of James's grief for nearly a year, the fixed point around which 11 months of Wednesdays had orbited. Noah stood beside James close enough that their arms were touching, looking at his own name in the marble, with an expression James could not fully read, something between wonder and the particular distance children achieved when they were processing something larger than their current vocabulary. Noah reached into his coat pocket. He brought out the red boat, the one that had traveled with him to Northridge, that had been hidden under a mattress in a locked dormitory, that had made the journey to Delmore Street, that had sat on Ruth's shelf for 11 months, that Noah had pressed into James's hands and James had placed on his desk and Noah had retrieved when he moved in and set next to the lamp in his room. The same boat. He held it in both hands for a moment, turning it over, looking at it quietly. Then he bent down slowly and placed it at the base of the headstone. James looked at his son. Noah straightened up. He looked at the boat, then at the stone, then at James. We don't need this anymore. You found me. We don't need the boat to remember. Walter began working. The process was careful, methodical, the practiced motion of someone who had been tending this ground for 32 years and understood that the work required attention rather than speed. The stone came up slowly. Beneath it was earth, only earth, the same as any other patch of ground in the cemetery, undisturbed, unremarkable, holding nothing. James looked at the empty space. He thought about what a year of standing above it had cost him, what it had cost Noah, what it had cost the ordinary mornings that should have existed in that year and hadn't. He thought about September, the baseball game, the foam finger. He thought about the weight of a year that had been built on something that weighed nothing at all, and about the particular courage of a man who admitted that the weight he had been carrying was partly his own construction. Lily was standing next to Ruth, watching James watch the ground. Her voice when she spoke was the same voice she had used in the cemetery the first time, observational, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who had decided to tell the truth and found it simpler than the alternative. Now the stone matches what's actually there. Ruth put her hand on Lily's shoulder. Walter stood with the removed headstone beside him, not looking at it, looking at the trees. The bare oak branches made their particular pattern against the winter sky, the kind of structure that was legible, even stripped down to its essential lines. Everything unnecessary removed, what remained enough. James crouched down to the level of the ground. He looked at the empty rectangle of earth where the stone had been. He stayed there for a moment, not performing anything, not making it mean more than it was, just marking it the way a person marks the end of something that had required a great deal of them to endure. Then he stood up. He took Noah's hand. Noah's fingers closed around his immediately, without hesitation, the grip of a child who had been practicing this for a long time in his imagination and was now doing it in fact. They walked back along the gravel path, the 5 of them, toward the iron gate at the far end of the cemetery. Behind them, the empty rectangle of ground sat in the pale January sun, holding nothing, meaning nothing now except the end of a lie. At the gate, Noah looked back once. Then he looked up at James. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way he said most important things, without decoration, as if the weight of something should be sufficient without the wrapping. I never stopped waiting. James looked down at his son, at the face he had talked to for 11 months, through a piece of marble at the eyes that had looked at him in the doorway of a small room on Delmore Street, and run the calculation of whether trust was possible one more time. He tightened his hand around Noah's. I know. I'm here now. That's the only direction this goes from here. Lily walked through the gate first, as she had walked through the first gate between James and the truth, without ceremony, without waiting for anyone's permission. Ruth followed. Walter pulled the iron gate closed behind them with the practiced motion of a man who understood the significance of what you left behind you when you walked out. The five of them moved together down the sidewalk toward the cars, the January light flat on the pavement around them, the city of Columbus conducting its Saturday morning business on every street around them, ordinary in every direction. A man, his son, the people who had made it possible to stand in the same sentence. That evening, James sat at his desk. The house had sound in it now, Noah upstairs doing something that involved periodic footsteps and occasional laughter at whatever Lily was saying on the other end of the phone, Ruth and Walter having stayed for dinner and gone home an hour ago. The house had stopped echoing. James had noticed it some weeks prior without being able to say exactly when it had changed the way you notice a sound, only after it has stopped. He opened his desk drawer, took out the legal pad. He looked at the first sentence he had written the night he came home from Delmore Street, the first time, the night he had understood what the year had actually been. He had written it with enough pressure that the words had left an impression on the pages beneath. He read it now. They buried an empty coffin and stole a year of my son's life. He looked at it for a long moment. The sentence was accurate. It would always be accurate. It described something that had happened and could not be made to not have happened. But it was no longer the last sentence, which was the only thing that mattered now. He turned to a clean page, picked up his pen, wrote one new sentence. He found his way back. He set the pen down. From upstairs, Noah's footsteps crossed the floor, paused, crossed back. The ordinary sound of a child moving through a house that knew him. James left the legal pad open on the desk, closed the drawer, turned off the desk lamp. The house held its sound around him, full in the way that mattered, full in the only way that had ever actually counted.